Hi guys, in today's video I've narrated two sections from Discover Your Personal Myth Ultimate Handbook, written by my professional mentor and depth psychologist with 40 years of clinical experience, Steve Richards. The first section is a practical guide for a woman to uncover her Animus Type. We have an equivalent video for men linked down below. The second is on the structure of the relating system, as an interconnected system of instincts that provide the architecture for the flow of energy and information within the psyche. Both of these sections, when taken together, provide a firm foundation for the clinician, or individual looking for self-development, to guide someone, in this context women primarily, back into their personal myth through line for the purposes of better adapting to the outside world. We really hope you enjoy. Distilling your Animus Type. Becoming conscious of the platonic form of the masculine within your psyche, and how this has secretly guided your relating, both inner and outer, all of your life. The platonic form here is the intuited rather than the specific concept, so there's a direct crossover between Plato's intuition, or dialectic, of the forms, and Jung's concept of archetypes, one that includes a different emphasis, congruent with neuroscience, biology, and empiricism. Quote by Stephen T. Richards. Distilling your Animus Type. The Platonic form of the Animus Type refers here to the innate representational system that prefigures and anticipates female experience of the masculine out in the psychosocial and natural world. Following Jung, this is conceived of as a virtual image, without definite form as such, but with a set of qualities that are released instinctively, and then met with and confirmed psychosocially. This produces a very specific Animus Type, which is unique to the individual, but which at the same time contains the original archetypal imprint from the genome. Jung borrowed the term archetype from Plato, who used the term interchangeably with that of form. There are nuances that can separate archetype from form, but here it is used in the sense that Plato intuited the concept of form and archetype in a way that Jung later attempted his own conceptualization of, to mean a primordial image that is virtual and present as an archetype in the psyche of humankind. Jung's archetypal theory became elaborated and separated out from his early emphasis on experimental psychology, biology, and medicine into metaphysics. Its use in psychosystems analysis and in the personal myth process returns to Plato's intuition of something outside of normal perception that seems to represent a universal pattern or configuration, somehow involved in the material, physical, instantiation, manifestation, of whatever it is that the form represents archetypally. Plato believed that the form of something was an idealized blueprint, so that every copy of that in the material world was an imperfect version of this pure or archetypal pattern projected into physical being. In this context, the Platonic form of the masculine would represent a blueprint from which any, indeed all, individual men could be derived and distilled. Plato's intuition was very likely informed by an unconscious understanding that, in what we conceive of now as biology, there was a form, in this case, for the masculine, both as a psychological factor and as a physical man. Plato did not know about the genome, and his understanding of psychology was limited by the capacities of the philosophical systems of the day, notably, in his case, dialectics. Given Plato's intuition and Jung's later elaboration away from hard science, Jung's archetype of the animus is here referred to as the Platonic form of the masculine relating function, and put firmly into the context of biology, the logos of life, and its human genome. We'll now look at the process of distillation that occurs largely unconsciously across a woman's lifespan development, as she encounters manifestations of the Platonic form of the masculine, projected onto real men in the psychosocial world, and as internal resultant images that arise and take specific form in her psyche, to populate and illustrate her journey through life, in dreams, fantasies, relationships, as all that is generative in her being, and all too that is destructive. Asking the question. All women know, for as Plato said, all knowledge is remembering. The relating function for women is different in kind than that for men. Women are born from the same biological sex, whereas for men, it's from the opposite sex. For a girl, the first caring and nurturing relationship is with their own gender. A mother's love should provide confirmation of her daughter as being like her, but separate. For a boy, however, it is to be both different to his mother and separate. Jung's understanding of that part of the relating function and system that he called the animus highlights the otherness of the masculine as experienced by an infant girl. Her attachment to the father, or father figure, must be instinctive, and to some extent against the inertia of her first attachment to her mother. A primal role for the father is to be the interface between his family and the world, an instinctive guardian and mediator. For a girl to relate, in safety, to the dangers of the world, her instincts will attach to him, seeking confirmation of herself as a woman in waiting, and as a valued human being, worthy of nurturing and protection. These primordial facts of early attachment and confirmation are deeply ingrained in the genome, and play out via the timed release and expression of instinct, regardless of any transient cultural fashion that may be superimposed upon it. The animus, for a young girl, represents the first conscious psychosocial split that she will experience. Her relating function and its developing relating system, her animus complex, was prefigured in her genome, and through instinctive attachments contained the imagoes of both of her parents as a relating duality within herself. Her mother representing a loving caregiver, but also the anticipation of her future development. Her father in his role representing the embodiment of otherness and the anticipation of future confirmation of her biological nature by the collective masculine. As a child, she'll be conscious of the split in her relating function, but the true nature of it remains at an instinctive level of awareness. For a girl, the early caring, and for Freud, erotic, attachment to the same-sex parent has consequences that for boys do not arise. Girls are born of women, so too are boys. A boy's first caring and erotic attachment is onto the parents of the opposite sex. Freud considered this to be part of the Oedipal or Electra stage of development, specifically here, when a girl's affection is transferred in proto-erotic form away from the mother and onto the father. However, that original primal attachment to the same-sex parent persists, evidenced in the deeply emotional and often erotic relationships girls have with their own sex. For a girl, the early, and from a Freudian-based perspective, erotic, attachment to the same-sex parent has consequences that for boys do not arise. Girls are born of women, so too are boys. A boy's first caring and erotic attachment is onto the parent of the opposite sex. A very interesting experiment to run is to ask men to imagine how their relationship to their father, and to the male sex in general, would have been different had their father been their birth parent. This often shocks men into the realization that the relating function and system in women develops very differently, with psychosexual and consequent psychosocial effects that they had never considered. A girl's relationship to her father is essentially built around preparation for life beyond the family. However, by the principle of what is within, so too is without, the relating system, or animus complex, thus forming within the psyche of the girl, will be the template for interpreting the psychosocial world. This is anticipated by the genome, hence the instinctual attachments and roles that prefigure psychosocial development. To the extent that a girl, and later herself as a woman, remains unconscious of this dynamic, her animus relating complex is decisive in shaping her personal myth. This, then, is anamnesis, which is, in the depth psychological sense, access to the far memory of that original Platonic form of the masculine, first released as a projection onto the birth father. A literal memory? No, but an intuition, a feeling or affect that links a woman via instinct to the anticipation of what was or should have been. The template, originating in the genome, and then fleshed out by an ongoing experience of the masculine, is that from which a woman on her quest to uncover her personal myth may thus distill the remembrance of her animus type. We now turn to the actual process of distilling the animus type, a weaving of the thread. Weaving the thread. Ask any woman to recall her first awareness of attraction to boys, and she'll probably remember immediately. Where this doesn't happen, or if recall doesn't start until her middle to late teens, then it's likely that some of her memories of childhood have been repressed, or otherwise quite normally forgotten. If they've been repressed, it may indicate that some wound or trauma that affected the development of her relating system occurred well before her first recalled memory of interest in or attraction to boys. This may not be the case, but the possibility must be considered. The psyche uses autobiographical memories as nodal points of attention, either directly, as in drawing our conscious recall to a particular memory, or indirectly, by repressing access to memory. This repression creates a negative attention to the times, situations, or events that cannot be recalled. In effect, they're conspicuous by their absence. Gaps in memory are usual, of course, and may have no significance as such. The process of actively associating memories and emotions often brings about the recollection of things previously forgotten. There's also the possibility of false memory syndrome, which must always be considered. The psyche is creative and can associate or even produce memories that did not happen, and these can block or otherwise cover up the recall of real, actual memories. Weaving the thread can start at any recall point. For our purposes, we will assume a normal memory process, which will involve an increasing volume of memories and associations as engagement with the personal myth continues. First memories of attraction often lead back to early school days, sometimes before. There's usually no explicitly sexual content, but there is certainly interest, fascination, and attraction. The prefigured intentionality of the relating function is to prepare girls for the adaptive tasks of puberty and adolescence. These early attachments to boys hint to her the shape of her adult future as a woman in waiting. So deeply hardwired is this that it instinctively causes her to refer back to the model provided by her parents, or caregivers, and wider family. As the relating function develops into a girl's specific relating system, her personal animus complex in Jungian terms, Jung's animus archetype, begins to take shape through projection of its virtual platonic form onto the real boys she meets, blended with elements either positive or negative that she transfers from personal experience of her father and other significant male caregivers in her life. Jung's father archetype and complex. Jung was not a systematic thinker in the sense that he integrated or finalized his model of the psyche. The distinction between his animus and father archetypes is very unclear, both theoretically and practically. Each, however, are clearly elements of the relating function, grounded in the intentionality of the genome, and expressed through the drive to relate. Relating is biological, psychological, and social, with mate and relate being a priori to any psychological consideration that isn't in service to these innate and fundamental imperatives. The young girl's developing psyche, then, has to contend with the task of relating both to the anticipatory demands of her biology and to the psychosocial world. Without her even being conscious of it, this process also shapes her sense of self and her relationship to her inner world. In the context of the personal myth, the boys, and later the men she is attracted to, take on a very significant role in the development of her personality. Jung refers to the animus as a soul image, which is meaningful in the sense that girls experience the affect or emotion attached to the projections they make onto these boys. It is now understood in affective neuroscience and in neuropsychoanalysis that affect is the bridge between instinct and ego consciousness, with the emotion signalling a deep structure need that is seeking fulfillment of itself. The numinous quality Jung ascribed to the animus as a consciously experienced image places it very firmly in the category of instinct, with all the compulsive and fascinating power that arises out from the genome. Beginning with recall of the earliest boy she was attracted to, the adult woman, distilling her animus, should note aspects of appearance, not just in an obvious physical sense, but also in terms of his movement and perceived or felt energy. This should start with her perceptions, literally her sense impressions of the boy, and then her own feelings, perhaps emotionally and certainly compulsively, with the desire to look at him being prominent. This is the snapshot taken through her eyes, and the simultaneous unconscious comparison made between him and the virtual image within. The product of this snapshot and inner image is confirmation by projection. The resultant effect is attraction. Attraction, then, further attracts other latent elements, both directly from the genome, via instinct, and from previous personal experience of the masculine, the complex. The Platonic form of the masculine is virtual, just as Jung said of his animus archetype. The biological imperative for this is to provide a basis for successful mating and relating that is wide enough for reproduction to occur. In other words, a bandwidth of potential mates should be attractive enough and viable enough for mating with. This optimizes adaptation to the available gene pool. However, there is a built-in genomic regulator that provides for the stability of the bandwidth of acceptable mates. There should be a baseline of attraction that makes reproduction more likely in a genetically competitive struggle for survival. Hence, the average man is attractive enough to the average woman. This is the basis for the virtual quality of the Platonic form and Jung's archetype of the animus. It appears in consciousness as something immediately attractive and interesting. Plato's original intuition about his theory of forms was certainly grounded in the innate knowledge that there was an image, in this case of the masculine, that was universal or collective, and outside of personal experience. It exists a priori. And in that sense, it's independent of any specific man, but also paradoxically stands for all of them as an archetype, Jung. The Platonic form of the masculine must be a representation of men, out from which, in its closest approximation to the archetype, it is possible to distill out any man, or at least any man who is close enough to the baseline imago that all women carry. The projection and reciprocal imprinting that begins with the first sensory impression of attraction in childhood starts the process of distilling out the personal animus type. So powerful is this, because of its fundamental genomic nature, that it becomes a leitmotif of attraction and relating, both internal and external, for life. Following the thread woven by the projection of the Platonic form will lead a woman onwards through all the significant way stations of her life. Jung was clear that, in his view, the archetype and therefore the form of the masculine was polarized into positive and negative. It can certainly be modelled in that way, as it has convenience intellectually, but lived life suggests a far more complicated relationship that dynamically shifts across a bandwidth of impressions, projections, and personal experience. If it was so simple as positive versus negative, it would be far easier to deal with these hypothesized opposites, as they'd be clearly in relief and without the paradox routinely encountered in real relationships. Extremes, as in polarities, do have an easy conditioning effect, and not always a helpful one. Nature will always default to survival advantage, and negative effects condition more readily than positive, pain versus pleasure, as these create avoidance of harmful, even fatal experiences. As the Platonic form distills out into the personal animus type, experiences that are both positive and negative gather around the resolving image. The form in itself should be predominantly positive, as this facilitates mating, hence the powerfully positive affects of romantic love and attachment. The negative pole of Jung's animus will be based on some innate representational factors of the masculine, as written into the genome, but they only make sense not as a simple polarity within a single form, but rather as a contradiction to the positive. In this sense, the Platonic form of the animus is only positive. The negative pole of Jung's archetype is associated to it, but is something intrinsically separate, albeit as anticipated by the genome. There should be no self-destructive pole to the relating function, whose innate purpose is mating and relating. As a system, it must be optimally attuned to its purpose. A biological correlate would be an organ that acted against itself, as in a heart that was continually trying to stop, rather than to beat. Jung's negative pole of the animus will be based on the flexibility of the animus complex, to accommodate experiences that are outside of the optimal intentionality of the form. This has survival value. There will be innate predictions within the genome to prepare for this, but infants do not expect the negative. Their attachment must be optimized for the positive. Where the actual experience contradicts the positive, then personal security at the very least is threatened. Multiple adaptive drives and instincts will activate to deal with this, as will ongoing learning. The resultant experience will have a negative complex as its effect. That plasticity is sufficient in most senses, without hypothesizing that the innate form of relating is bipolar within a single relating function. Bipolarity would infer that instincts were negative as much as positive, with respect to an individual's best interests. Most people who suffer from the effects of others relating negatively to them suffer from one or more complexes. The relating function will certainly have the competitive interests of the individual encoded within it, and so can, and will, motivate a person to act negatively towards someone else, if so required. Competition socially, for mating and relating, where men or women undermine one another openly, or as frenemies, is a common example of this. The negative animus, as it may undermine a woman from within, is most often, therefore, a complex based on learning and conditioning, rather than a Jungian archetype as such. The special case of Thanatos, conceived of as a death drive, Freud, or as an instinct, purposefully aiming at adaptation to the inevitable biodegradable recycling of the organism, back into the environment, is a different, but at some stages of the life cycle, connected process. The genomic self mobilizes various instinctive systems in service of the relating function, and these of course operate in and through the development of the relating system, the animus complex in this case. Taken together, they contribute to the apparent polarity of relating per se. The overall regulation by the genomic self will mean that, in those cases where there's an issue with the genome itself, then any innate components of sociopathy, narcissism and psychopathy, etc., will all play their part in the development of the relating system too. Continuing with the process of distillation, by following the imagoes and experiences that have illustrated a woman's relational life, in drawing up a timeline of significant boys and men who have affected her, she can mark out the progress of her personal myth that, up to now, has been unconscious. What is very likely is that she will see the emergence of a definite type in terms of appearance and of character. Superficial differences may conceal this, but it will be there. The more unconscious a woman is of her relating function and system, the more the deep structure elements of her type will be hidden from her awareness. A projection of an animus type onto someone who turns out to be wrong is often based on the platonic form of the animus, overriding the intrinsic character and personality of the boy or man who has been projected or transferred onto. Love is blind. The unconscious insistence that the platonic form is real leads women into affairs outside of their marriage or committed relationship. Behind that, of course, are the instincts, with their imperatives to adapt optimally, including the biological mating, Freud, and social relating, Adler, drives. There is a tendency for men and women to unconsciously romanticize their respective platonic forms, and it's important to understand the mechanisms behind this. Firstly, the form exists latently in the genome as a virtual image. It reaches consciousness as a fact, experienced as either a spontaneous image arising from within, or seeing, meeting, someone who is a suitable enough representation of the virtual image to unconsciously project onto. Note that projection and transference are always unconscious. However, just as frequently, someone we know grows on us by manifesting characteristics that induce the projection. Another example is the simple recognition of our type, by reference to past experience, and then preferentially selecting someone for a relationship based on that learned type. In this example, the choice may seem to be just that, fully conscious and aware, but that would be to ignore the history of our projections and transferences insofar as we remain unconscious of the deep structure platonic form behind all of them. Humans have the blessing, and the curse, of an enlarged cerebral cortex. This gives us huge spare capacity with respect to information processing, which is overwhelmingly unconscious, including the instinctive pressure to virtually act out or imagine fantasies about relationships. Many people believe that they create their fantasies. Jung noted that they seem instead to create themselves, out from the unconscious and ultimately, therefore, instinctive imperatives originating in the genome. The idealism and romanticism that some of these fantasies take on reveal the platonic form, or where there is not present, simple instincts in crude, unvarnished representation. Following the thread of your animus type from its earliest beginnings will reveal the hidden continuity of your relating system, as it shapes your relationships externally to others and internally to yourself. In being the realization of the relating function, it serves as the active agent of the genome in the world, the systematic manifestation of instinct. It's the regulator of, and the resolution to, the shadow. See Tracing the Shadow. Its presence punctuates a woman's life at every significant nodal point in her development. Every success or failure she has will be connected to this ever-present factor. Its presence is felt in every neurosis and maladaptation, and in every resolution to human suffering. Creativity is the left hand of the relating system. Left-handed insofar as this symbolises the unconscious and the role of the human hand in producing something new through action in the world. The right hand is relating itself, and, as this should be as close as possible to reflexive consciousness, the symbolism of right-handedness is appropriate. Distilling the animus is a conscious process, a true opus, and the sine qua non, the not without, of the personal myth, the personal equation, and Jung's model of conscious individuation. Ordinary, natural individuation requires no elevation in consciousness, but relating is still key nevertheless. Everything that happens to us must be mediated through the relating function and its distilled relating system. Everything biological, psychological, and psychosocial. Consciously or not, psychoreductively or not, everything relates to everything else. This is a systems-based homeostasis, which is regulated by the genome and delivered relationally. Distilling the animus must be seen in its context, which is, as we have said above, the personal myth. Key points in this distillation process are 1. Finding your earliest memory of interest in and attraction to boys and the wider masculine. What was it about him that attracted you? How did you feel? 2. Becoming conscious of the ecology of your life at that time. Your level of development, consciousness, sense of identity and self, family and wider relationships, the environment within which you lived, social, urban, and/or natural. 3. Remember your affect state in relation to this first anchoring memory. This will be an affect bridge to further understanding. 4. Be receptive to the psyche. It will associate other memories and emotions. Follow what the psyche shows you, either through spontaneous recall or through concentrated, conscious effort. 5. Be wary of fantasy. Note it, as it, fantasy, will have been a feature of a younger state of your consciousness. Try not to be distracted. The key is to be receptive and not to become absorbed. We want to weave the thread, not to be woven into it. If you hold the tension between these two, the psyche will offer a third, or transcendent position. If you time your relating to the psyche just right, this third position will be transpersonal in its qualitative affect. Often a sense of self extending back in time before your individual personal life will emerge, as if an apperception or remembrance of another kind of existence. Some will interpret this as a past life. It's important not to be seduced by this fantasy. Much more likely, it's a direct feeling arising from the genomic self, felt as being what Jung called a numinosum. In this case, a communion directly from the ancestral heritage of the genome itself. Such transpersonal experiences are at once collective and deeply personal. It's a real clue to the origin of our personal psychology from the unfolding genome. 6. Progress forward in time. Link up as many memories as you can of boys and men you've been significantly attracted to. Collate aspects of their appearance, character, personality, etc., and in particular how they affected you, emotionally, and in terms of how much attention you gave to them as an inner image. 7. Note the boys and men out from your timeline who have appeared in your dreams, if they have reoccurred throughout your life, and what was happening for you in outer life when they made their appearances in your dreams. Note the kinds of fantasy media, novels, films, TV, streaming series, video games, etc., that you are drawn to. How do you react to the images of the masculine therein? 9. If you are in a relationship, compare your partner to the conscious awareness you have of your platonic form. Could you resist an approach by someone who embodied it, as much or more than your partner? 10. Track your animus and the men you have projected or transferred onto. Check for similarities and differences in character, personality, and appearance. Were these transferences and projections ultimately valid, in that the recipient could justifiably carry them? 11. Track any mental illness, neurosis, and distress in your lifetime up to the present day. Correlate these with any relationships to any significant boys or men in your life. Correlate too with any inner work, creativity, or significant event in your life at these times. Find the footsteps of the animus as he walks beside you. 12. Note any masculine imago that you routinely use, spontaneously and without conscious intention, either in sexual fantasy or in reflections about those ideas and values you hold as being central to your life and your future. Are you drawn back to the memory of a relationship from the past, even from childhood? Do you ever wonder about how a past relationship may otherwise have turned out? Likewise, do you fantasize about a future with this imago? 13. If you are creative in any sense, how does the animus relate actively as a present and articulating force in your creative life? Do you have a muse? If so, is he internal or external? If internal, what characteristics of appearance and personality does he have? How are these related to your animus type? 14. What would be your wish after your death, and you had wanted to be buried? Would you be buried with your present partner, if you have one, or someone else? The symbolism of internment is related to alchemy as presented in the Rosarium. 15. Do you fantasize about another life next time around with someone? Is he a person you've known in your life, or a fantasy figure? What characteristics does or would such a person have? How do they correlate with your idealized Platonic form? The above are specimen pointers in engaging with the relating system, or animus complex. Once you have a conscious relationship to the imago of him, you can begin the process of a true psychological relationship, either or externally with a real partner, or internally with the imago. However, that psychological relationship must of course be understood in its fullest context, which is as emergent from the genome, biology, with the intentionality to be acted out via instinct toward optimal adaptation in the real psychosocial world. This is the distillation of your animus type. The relating function, core structure of the relating system, genome, form, instinct, and complex. The following diagrams show the interrelationship between the genome, the innate emotional or Panksepian instinct systems, the innate Platonic representational system, Jung's Anima or Animus archetype, and the relating complex, Jung's Anima or Animus complex. The first example is the basic relating system. The second, the core structure of the anima. The third, the core structure of the animus. Each is built around the genomic self, with the Platonic form and relating complex, either for a biological male or biological female. This simplifies the Jungian distinctions between instinct, archetype, and complex, and shows how each both structurally and functionally interrelate. The relating system, Anima Animus complex, is the personal manifestation of the deep structure relating function, which itself is prefigured, regulated, and controlled by the genome. The genomic self, Jung's self-archetype, as the emergent psychological level of analysis, description, and explanation of the genome, is at the core of this interrelated system. It can be seen as an internal projection of the image of the genome, as accommodated by the limitations of ego consciousness, and represented symbolically within culture. In the diagram below, we see a schematic representation of this interrelationship, with the genomic self, the Platonic form, the relating complex, and 4 of the Panksepian basic emotional or instinct systems. This illustrates how Jung's model of instinct, archetype, and complex is unified within the psychodynamic, biopsychosocial, neuroscience, and neuropsychoanalytic framework, that is, psychosystems analysis. On screen is a diagram of a dynamic component of the relating function, the systemic interrelationship between the genomic self, Panksepian core instinctual systems, the Platonic form, and the relating complex. The Panksepian systems are play, seeking, lust, and care. Relating is the key. The relating function is present immediately from birth as a Platonic representational system, Jung's archetype, and acts under the direction of instinct directly from the genome. The Anima and Animus complexes develop over our lifespan as systems components of the relating function, which includes the genome, the representational Platonic form, all relevant Panksepian instinctual systems, and the relating complex. In the diagram below, specified for a male, we see a schematic representation of the genomic self, the feminine Platonic form, the Anima relating complex, and 4 of the Panksepian basic emotional instinct systems. In the diagram on screen, specified for a female, we see a schematic representation of the genomic self, the masculine Platonic form, the Animus as relating complex, and 4 of the Panksepian basic emotional instinct systems. This illustrates how Jung's model of instinct, archetype, and complex is unified within the psychodynamic, biopsychosocial, neuroscience, and neuropsychoanalytic framework, that is, psychosystems analysis. Based on the enormous level of interest in our IPSA professional training course, leading to accreditation as a hypnotherapist and psychotherapist, we are now open to accepting applications to train with us all year round, with the next CADA launching in January 2022. If you're interested in studying to become a professional depth psychologist through Steve and Pauline's psychosystems analysis model, then check out the application process through the link in the description. Thanks.